Hi, I'm Richard Westerby and welcome to the IVF Daddies podcast. Today we have one of our previous interviewees back, Aemilia. Hello, Aemilia.
Hello. Again.
Thankfully this time there's a glass of wine involved, not a cup of tea. We've grown up. Today we're going to follow on from your story. So as a bit of a recap, aged 40, you went through an egg freezing process and harvested 13 premium quality eggs. And that's where we left off. Where are you now?
Where am I now? I am now sitting across you.
In my sitting room.
In your sitting room. But I have a little 6-month-old daughter that is sitting in my flat with her grandmother because I have come to London for work. But I have had a beautiful little girl this year.
Woohoo! Congratulations. And not only is she a beautiful little girl, she's my goddaughter.
She is?
Yes.
She is. I don't think that she could not be your godmother.
Yeah. Freeze your eggs. Have a baby. Yes, I will be the godfather.
You are, and you were there when she was born.
I was. Well, not there in the room, but I was outside.
On the day.
On the day, I was there, yeah.
Yeah.
So it just makes me smile thinking about it now. So let's recap to where we left off, which is you've got your eggs frozen. They're in a clinic. Over to you.
As I said, I had my eggs frozen. I breathed a big sigh of relief that I no longer had this unknown pressure that I had about needing to have the biological clock ticking and everything. I gave myself a 5-year window to find my fairy tale. And within that period of 5 years, I met a wonderful person, a boy.
Ooh, a boy.
And he is the father of this beautiful little girl. So we met in London. We dated like any normal couple. And there is a little bit of a story in between this that before we got to where we are now, which is to decide to have a family, we started off a little bit wonky, I should say, because I didn't realize, but I fell pregnant 4 years ago, so maybe
naturally.
6 months into the relationship, naturally, by accident. Didn't know that I was pregnant, and a couple of months later experienced an ectopic pregnancy.
So what does that mean?
That means that I doubled up in pain, went to the hospital, was told that I had an ectopic pregnancy, which was not viable, but it hadn't burst. So with an ectopic, it can be very dangerous once it bursts.
So what is an ectopic pregnancy, though?
An ectopic pregnancy is when the embryo is stuck in the fallopian tube.
So what is an ectopic pregnancy?
An ectopic pregnancy is when the embryo is growing in the fallopian tube and could burst, at which point it becomes a life-threatening event. Okay. So what happened to me was that I started feeling pain or doubling up in pain that I had never experienced, and I thought I had a fever for most of a day. Then, knowing myself and my body and how I was feeling, realized that this is not normal for me. So I took myself to the hospital. They asked me, what are the chances of my being pregnant? I said close to 1%. And they came back and they said that 1% is
You're pregnant.
True, which was a bit shocking for me because I had to decide what to do.
Yeah.
And then they suggested that I have an ultrasound so that they can check where the pregnancy was. And
So they did a blood test to see if you were pregnant?
They did a blood test to see if I was pregnant and suggested I then go for an ultrasound. They were doing the ultrasound, couldn't find the embryo, and then they found it in the fallopian tube.
And then what happened?
And they asked me, what do you want to do? And at that point, I said, tell me if it's viable, because that's the only way for me to decide. Otherwise, this is something that has a result of its own.
Yeah.
They did tell me that it wasn't viable and I had to have an operation, and they wouldn't let me leave the hospital because it hadn't burst and therefore it could become very dangerous.
And how are you feeling?
Scared, shocked, but it had to be done. So I called you.
You did. You called me.
I called you because at the time I wasn't sure who to call, what to do. I didn't even call my boyfriend at the time, but I just called you because you're my person. And I, at that point, realized I didn't even realize that I had been pregnant. So I had to digest that I was pregnant in a process of a few hours and then wouldn't be.
Yeah.
And I decided to even name the little embryo Shrimpy and just knew that it had to go. But that was a very catalyst moment for me to realize that I did, in fact, want a child at some point, and it hadn't resonated as much until that time. Anyway, the continuation is that I had the operation, and then obviously had to have some tests to see if everything was fine and how what the state of my situation was. So I had to have an operation to remove the embryo.
So an operation, explain what that means.
I had to be taken into an operating theatre, and what I was told is that there would be a laparoscopic operation which would remove the embryo, and I found out afterwards that they had removed one of my fallopian tubes.
And how did you feel at that? Finding out afterwards, not before?
It was part of the process. I didn't have a choice. That's what happens when you have an ectopic. So I didn't know what to feel, because all I knew is that I then had to go to my gynecologist that I trusted implicitly and have various tests to understand the viability of my fertility after that.
Yeah,
and the
impact,
first thing
and the impact on your fertility. So you've had this conversation now with your partner. You've got to crunch time. Were you feeling supported? Tell me how the relationship was at that moment.
So we were in a good place from a communication perspective. And when we agreed to go through the process, his initial thought was, let's try naturally. I had already been to a doctor, and I was told that now, at the age of 45, going on 46, it naturally was, the stats of naturally were quite low for me.
Okay.
So the doctor had said to me, so I'd gone to my gynecologist referred me to a specialist IVF doctor. And he said to me that the chances of me getting pregnant naturally at this age are between 1% and 2%.
Wow.
So I said that to my boyfriend, who still wanted to give us a period of trying naturally just to see if it would work.
Right.
And I agreed with that. That was part of our negotiation, if you like. And so we had the discussion in May. We had the discussion to agree to have a child in April. From April until September, we agreed that we would try naturally. If it didn't work, we were going to go the IVF route with the eggs that I had frozen around September.
Okay.
He tried to backtrack because he's a guy and he wasn't sure what he wanted, and he wasn't sure if it was the right time and everything. So what I suggested to him is that he goes to the doctor, and rather than me transmit what I've heard from the doctor, he asks any question he wants. Why can't we try naturally? What's going to happen? Why shouldn't we wait? What if we wait a little bit longer? And most of the answers were very simple. The best answer I think the doctor gave him very naturally was, you've already decided to do this.
So
if
why
you've
wait?
decided now, why are you waiting? You don't even know if it's going to work the first time. So just give it a go. If it's not now and it's 2 months from now, it's really not going to make that big a difference. And I think that calmed him down. It resonated to make the decision.
And then what happened?
So naturally didn't work.
Surprise.
1 to 2%. And then I knew, because I had set my timing for late September. So therefore, from August, I started self-care to prep. I was taking conception vitamins. I stopped drinking alcohol. I spent a lot of calm Zen time in my island house under the sun.
De-stressing, just focusing on you.
Decompressing and being in a healthy, balanced place.
Right.
It's the way that I prepped for the egg freezing.
Yeah.
Maybe not by lying in the sun for a month, but I basically took vitamin D. I ate healthily. I had already for a year been doing acupuncture with my acupuncturist who specializes in fertility and knew about this process. So in essence, I'd been preparing my body for months.
Yeah, so you were literally doing all of the nutrition, you were de-stressing, you were getting yourself into mentally, physically, and emotionally a place where you knew that this is what you wanted to happen.
And then I was told by the IVF doctor, I already knew when to prepare and what to do. So what he said to me was, the moment you get your period, on day 2, you need to start taking X medication.
Right.
And that from that day, the IVF exercise, if you like, began. And what happened is that I was in my island house. I returned to Athens. I had planned it down to the letter from a date perspective. So I started taking the medication because my period works like clockwork. I started taking the medication, and he was the one who would tell me when D-Day was.
He being the doctor or your partner?
The doctor.
Okay.
My partner, within this period of deciding when D-Day would be, had to come to the clinic, sign 1 million documents with me where we needed to decide that if the embryos were allowed to be used for research and testing, and whether we could freeze, whether I was able to use them if some sad event would take place and maybe I would pass away or he would pass away, what would we do with... So tons of paperwork.
So the clinic basically went through all eventualities to cover all bases around what could be done with the embryos.
As well as a notarial deed that made him recognize that he was the father of the child that we would create if the exercise was to be successful.
Okay, so they're covering bases legally to make sure that you and he are parents, irrespective of how things go, like on paperwork at least. Okay, so you've done all this paperwork. How did that feel with regards the clinic? Were they being too much, too little? How did you feel?
The clinic is one of the best clinics in Athens, in Greece. The paperwork that was given to us was not, if you like, explained in full detail. You just had to read what you were signing. And there was a lot of it to sign. But I think in the end, it was all the right documentation. It gave me safety that I knew exactly what would happen with the embryos if they were frozen, with any specimen from my partner, any eggs of mine, everything. So I was very pleased with the clinic.
So it gives you almost a feeling of relief that reassurance that you know that all eventualities are taken care of from a legal perspective and a clinic perspective, which is great. And I think knowing that your clinic is looking after you, because these are things you wouldn't necessarily think about.
Yeah.
And so for them to bring it to the table and say, hey, this is what you need to go through, read this, that's the sign of a really good clinic.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that is the interesting detail that I should add is that obviously nobody tells you what you want to how many embryos they need to inseminate, or they want to inseminate, or they should inseminate in the IVF process. So that I took ownership of that.
So how many embryos they were going to put into you?
So I did not want to have twins.
Why?
I don't know, but I just didn't.
Having watched me for 10 years raising twins.
I'll say. So what's interesting is that there's a component to all of these questions, research, and information that is the documentational part of it. But then there's the other part that I wanted to understand how this would manifest, if I would have twins, if I would have a single child, if there was a process by which you could choose of one of the two.
And how did you manifest? Did you sit down and talk with the clinic?
I asked questions,
you
a
just
lot of
sat
questions.
and asked. I think that's the best thing, just ask.
I basically asked, because all I know from IVF is that people have undergo IVF, and then mainly you see twins being born. So for no apparent reason, I did not want twins. I wanted to try to have one child. So I asked my doctor, what is the probability so how many embryos do you inseminate? And he said, we typically put in about 4 or 5 embryos, and of which usually 2 remain viable in the uterus universe.
So he said that you put in 4 or 5.
Yeah.
to try to get to
And
2.
I said, what is the probability of the 4 or 5 becoming twins? And he said about 40%. And I said, that's too high. I said, what if I want one child? And he said, you can opt for a single embryo transfer. To which most people from conversations that I've had have said to me, that's risky because it's not usually successful. And I said, it's my first time. I would rather go with a single embryo transfer because what are the probabilities, I asked, of there being twins? And he even said there's 1% because the embryo could split. And I said, I'm going for a single embryo transfer.
I do not want twins.
I don't want twins. I love your twins, but I did not personally want to have twins. I don't think I was ready to have twins. So I decided to go for a single embryo transfer. And that was something I had to state. Otherwise, they would have gone with a larger amount.
Wow. So you had... So you stated to the clinic you want a single embryo transfer, but what did you actually have to do? Did you sign paperwork? Did you have a conversation?
I had an offline private conversation with my doctor. I had already said to him and his assistant that I wanted a single embryo transfer, but at the time I had to choose how many eggs I had to thaw, and from those eggs, how many eventually we would decide from the successful embryos to go with for the IVF exercise.
Interesting. So it's almost like you were guiding your doctor along your wishes.
Yes.
You were taking control and saying to him, this is what I want, not
Absolutely.
saying just going with the flow.
No, because I think at the same time, this was my first time. It wasn't I had no failed attempts, and we'll get to that in a second because I've been very lucky. But I said to my doctor, first time, single embryo transfer, non-negotiable. I'm not listening to anything else. Not that he was trying to persuade me of any other way, but I was very adamant about my decision. At the time, because I had 13 little eggs in the freezer, I had to decide how many I would thaw.
So how many did you end up thawing?
I listened to you, and I listened to my other friend, who's the fertility expert, and both of you said to me that there is a very big probability that not all of them might stick with my partner's contribution. So I took out 8. I kept 5 backup, if you like, and I took out 8 under the assumption that 4 might become embryos.
So you were looking at a 50%. So taking 8, thawing 8, fertilizing 8, hoping to get to 4 embryos.
Yeah.
Amazing. And then what happened?
So they took out they defrosted, they thawed the 8 eggs, and they have to call me in 24 hours to tell me the success rate, which you had been managing my expectations, so had my other friend. And I expected that I'd be told like 3, 4, 5, which is what you guys had told me.
Yeah.
And they called me and they said, Miss Varfis, all 8 are viable.
100%er.
I was 100%er. They were saying that's a very positive result, but that was day 1, that they needed to survive to day 3 or day 5.
Amazing. So you've gone from 8 to 8, starting out of the blocks. That's an amazing number.
I go from 8 to 8. On Monday, they tell me it's 7, so 1 hasn't survived.
Yeah.
I come back on Wednesday, which is D-Day, that we're going to go with the process, undergo the IVF. And they came back and they said, you're a success story. All 8 are alive. The little one survived as well.
So the one that they said wasn't growing, they kept growing and it grew.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So you went from 8 eggs to 8 fertilized to 8 day 5 embryos. Mm-hmm. That's insane. I went from, for example, 12 eggs to 6 day 5 embryos. So a 50% attrition rate. And you had a 0% attrition rate. That is phenomenal. I guess those 13 premium eggs were premium.
They did say that I was a little bit of a case study.
Yeah.
And then embryo number 6 is what my little girl is today.
Amazing. So did they freeze them all?
So they at the time, 8 had survived. They picked embryo number 6. They inseminated the embryo. They told me to go home and lie down and not move. I was organizing a conference that day. So I literally had to shut my phone and behave.
Oh, so you listened. You didn't actually go and work. You went and lay down.
I went out for dinner that night.
Oh, okay, so again, you didn't
Which I wasn't
listen.
supposed to do, but I did. But they allowed me to do it because I picked a restaurant that was opposite my house and I was working. So I told them I had to do it. Anyway, and they then said that 2 did not survive past day 5, but 5 did. So I've got 5 embryos in the freezer now, as well as 5 eggs.
So they did a fresh transfer. They took embryo number 6, implanted that, froze, kept growing, and then froze the rest. So you've got 5 in the freezer.
5 in the freezer.
So they implant number 6. What then?
The implant number 6, I have to behave. I have to be calm. I had planned to travel to the US and then Mexico, and I was told that's impossible and I had to cancel all my plans, which was very strange for me. And I basically had to be calm and allow for the process to work and see if it would work. So I had to wait, I think, 8 days until I had to have a blood test to test my, tell me what it is because I don't remember what it is.
Human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG level.
That's the one, of which you were even trying to manage my expectations, say relax and we'll see and what's going on. First blood test showed positive results. Second blood test showed positive results. Third test, which was a pregnancy test at home, showed positive results. By which point I think that was the moment that you just said, oh my God, you're pregnant. And that's when I believed it. And then I basically had to just take care of myself and be
So when you're
calm.
doing those tests, when you're doing the blood tests, how did you manage the expectations for yourself to, because obviously everyone's like, oh, I want to be pregnant. How did you temper that with maybe it hasn't worked, maybe it has worked?
I thought it had worked.
You thought it had from day
As
one.
far as I was concerned, the process was going to work, and it did. So I think you were all trying to manage my expectations because I believed that this all was going to work. But maybe you should tell me why were you being so hesitant? Why were you trying to manage my expectations?
That's a great question to throw back at me. I didn't want you to be disappointed if it didn't work. And I guess from what I've understood from different people and I've been living through and helping, it can be really heartbreaking when it doesn't. So I guess that was one of the reasons why when you were doing your blood tests, I was always asking for the numbers. And I think the first one came back and it was like 120. It was over 100, which is always my benchmark to say that's a good starting number.
Oh, so you didn't tell me that then?
No, I didn't tell you that. But I was like, oh, that's good. And then the next one came back and it had risen. Because I remember for mine, the number was like 400, then went to 2,000. I was like, oh, crikey. And yours was over 100 and then went over to 1,000. I was like, oh, she's pregnant. But again, it's a hormone level. So until you have that ultrasound at 6 weeks, you don't really know. You don't see the heartbeat. You don't.
So that's what's interesting. I'll tell you what happened is after all I then bought this pack from Amazon that was, I could have like 20 pregnancy tests. So I can have one every day of the week just to make sure. Because then you guys had instilled this notion that I had to check every day. And then there was a point that I flew back to Greece because I was in London and I had to have an ultrasound that would show the baby heartbeat. And I had to tell all of you once I heard it. And I was like, oh, great, the heartbeat. All of you were in tears. Oh, my God. And my God, you're pregnant. And I was the only one who hadn't cried until I listened to it on my own in the car, having left the clinic.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I cry really easily. It's really annoying.
But yeah, no, I think going back to your question about how did I feel and if I was a bit insecure, I think I prepped myself in the best possible way, mentally, physically, self-care and everything that I possibly could. And I found it quite interesting because when you have to do the IVF process, you have to, at least in Greece where I was, they make you change your clothes and they put you in this little waiting room where this is where I saw very younger girls going in for egg freezing at 20 something, which you would never see in Greece beforehand.
When you did your egg freezing.
Yeah, so I saw them going in for egg freezing, and it made me really happy.
Yeah.
And then I saw other women who were asking me, "Oh, so how many times have you tried IVF?" And I said, "First time." And they were like, "Oh, wow." And I expected to hear the same from them. And I said, "How many times have you done it?" And they were like, "Oh, it's my 6th time." And I'm like, "What?" And I couldn't believe that it takes that long. I didn't quite know the effort sometimes of other people.
Some people
but
have
that person that told me that she was trying 6 times was not calm, did not shut up, was watching TV, had turned on the radio in that waiting room while I was just literally trying to think and trying to be in a very peaceful place. I'd done meditation in the morning and everything. And in my head, I had said, maybe if she doesn't chat so much or watch that much TV or pinch other people in the room, it might be more successful. I don't know. I saw a very big difference in behavior. I felt very bad for her that she had tried that many times in comparison to my first time. So I was literally saying, this has to work. This needs to work. This will work. I'm in a good place.
Yeah, but everybody copes with stress in different ways. And that was probably her coping mechanism to distract herself, to not, having done it, if this was her 6th time, that could be brutal. So I see both sides. I see the fact that if you're trying to be zen and calm and she's, here, look at the TV. And you're like, no, I don't really want to.
I remember her saying to me, do you mind if I put on the TV? And I just looked around. I was like, yes.
And she put it on anyway.
No, she compromised. She put the radio on instead.
So she's turned on the radio and you're like, yeah, great. I'm trying to be zen. And everything you've done is amazing. You've really looked after your body. You've looked after your nutrition. You've zened yourself to the max. And then all of a sudden you've got Greek radios blaring into your ears.
All I'm thinking is that I'm connected to Mother Earth. And this is going to work. But bless her, because she'd been trying for however many times. What I didn't know at the time, and I found out afterwards, having spoken to my doctor, who I went to visit for an ultrasound and everything, everybody's been telling me how lucky I've been that this worked in the first go, that it worked with a single embryo transfer, that it was worked. I had nurses that have come up to me during my pregnancy saying, oh my God, you did egg freezing at 40 and they let you do this and you have a successful egg production result. And all of this, I was looking at them very strangely saying, why is that strange?
Why is that strange? You work in this field. Why is that weird? That is quite interesting because I think when you are talking to people, I think there's an element of surprise, but it should be like, wow, that's amazing. Did you find it odd that people were almost shocked and surprised that you were pregnant and had been successful?
People were not shocked and surprised that I was pregnant. People were super happy for me that I was pregnant. People were shocked that I had undergone egg freezing at the age of 40 a lot of times. And even the nurses here at the NHS were saying that we would not have allowed that in England at that age for you to undergo an egg freezing exercise.
Really?
Yep. So when I said that I did it and I did it in Greece and it worked very well, they were very impressed.
I find that quite astounding because in most countries at the age of 40, if you want to go through egg freezing, you should be able to go through egg freezing, especially in the United States. If you want to do it at age 40, you can do it because we know that you're doing it for a reason. It's not like you're going in going, oh, let's do an egg freeze. You're going in because, like you said, you were looking for your fairy tale. You wanted to make sure that you had the optionality. So I find, again, this comes back to that whole societal, why are you doing this type thing? It's just, this should be the norm.
Well, if anything, it should have been that every single person that was involved in any capacity, be it a nurse, be it a doctor, be it whatever, should have been encouraging about the fact that I did undergo the process, did get pregnant, regardless of any of the taboo, the age, whatever.
Yeah.
And it was a little bit surprising to hear that from the nurses in the UK, and I was literally I shrugged it off. I said, why? I don't understand what the difference is for me to have done it at 40, and I was bloody successful as well.
Yeah.
But generally, I've realized how lucky I am in this whole effort. B, I have a miracle little baby.
You do, and she is beautiful.
Yes, she is. And I have had a very supportive group of friends and doctors.
How many people were involved in this?
You were involved? I had, well, so from a personal perspective, all of my friends, my close friends network was involved, either through emotional support or guidance or expert knowledge. And professionally, I went to my initial gynecologist that I had at the time in Greece, who helped me with the egg freezing. He left the country with the financial crisis. So I now have another gynecologist. He recommended and referred me to the IVF doctor, specialist, who is heading up the IVF clinic that I went to, who is immensely supportive. He had an assistant that handheld me through the process.
Okay.
And that's it. And obviously there were some people in the clinic for the documentation and the nurses and everything else, but mainly the protagonists from a medical perspective were my gynecologist, the IVF specialist, and his assistant.
So for you, it was actually relatively streamlined and efficient.
Yeah.
You didn't have to have escrow or surrogacy agencies, donor agencies, which is obviously the difference when you're going through egg freezing and IVF. It's all you.
It's all me because I had frozen my eggs.
Right.
I know, and I have friends that have undergone the same IVF process at this age that had not frozen their eggs, and they had to find an egg donor. They had to go through a little bit of a different process, and I don't know the full process.
Yeah.
But it wasn't as seamless as mine, if you like.
Yeah. So you, thankfully for you, had the ability to streamline it, as I said, because it was your eggs. So there were no lawyers involved. There were no agencies involved. It was your eggs, your doctor. And that's great that your doctor, your gynecologist, was able to refer you to a specialist that they knew and trusted. Again, It's that word of mouth, impartial advice, I think, is really important. I am so beyond thrilled that you could talk to us today, and the information you've given us is fantastic. Your story is amazing. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to share it with you.
And
if I can help anyone by saying this, then I will say, 1, freeze your eggs. 2, give yourself the flexibility to decide. And there is no taboo about this anymore. This is now science.
Yeah, and so those are...
And the fantasy comes true in most cases.
Amazing final words from you. Thank you so much for coming today and talking to us. It's been really valuable and we appreciate it. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.